Why do you believe you are the best person to lead the World Trade Organization at this time and in this geopolitical context?
Well, thank you. That's a loaded question, but let me begin by saying that the WTO is as important as it's ever been, because trade is very important, as important as it has ever been for the 21st century. And the WTO has the rules that underpins the multilateral trading system. But the WTO is facing a lot of challenges. I'll just mention 2 or 3 because they are related to the reason why I think I'm the best candidate. The WTO's dispute settlement system is paralyzed at the moment. And, you know, for a rule-making organization, this undermines the credibility if the very place where the rules can be monitored and people can bring complaints does not work. The WTO has not completed multilateral negotiations for quite some time, but their ongoing fisheries subsidies negotiations, which if brought to a conclusion, could really be a win for the WTO. We are in the midst of COVID-19 at the moment, and the WTO has some rules that could really make trade in medicines, vaccines, and pharmaceuticals much easier, more accessible. You remember many countries have put export restrictions on medical supplies and equipment, and there are some rules about members of the WTO having to notify others, making this export restriction temporary, transparent, and proportionate. Well, if we apply those rules, then it could help us to open up the trade in medical supplies and equipment.
And Sherwin joins us live now. Sherwin, this is so important. I mean, there seemed to be a consensus that global trade was generally good. And then we had the US President Donald Trump pushing back against that. So you had this 20-minute one-on-one with Africa's candidate for the top job. We saw some of it there, but just give us more, some of the big takeaways from that discussion.
Well, one of the questions was very much about her role, or certainly as a future possible Director-General of the World Trade Organization, what she saw her role in bringing those two superpowers back to the negotiating table. One will know that this is a fraught relationship spearheaded by President Donald Trump of the United States with China. But at the end of the day, these are the two largest economies in the world. And when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled below them. And the grass here representing developing countries. So we talked a bit about that. We talked about, the rise of protectionism, the rise of unilateralism in the context that so many world leaders are talking about, really trying to emphasize the importance of multilateralism. And also, there are a number of reforms required within the WTO system, specifically its two-tier dispute resolution mechanism, which has been hamstrung by a lack of approval in terms of candidates that Washington seeks to put on that dispute, or what they call the appellate division of the World Trade Organization. One of the questions, and I think this is important in the African context, Francis, was to ask her why she believes people watching at home, ordinary folk, my mum, your mum, our families, people in rural parts of Africa, why they should be interested in the machinations that determine the failures or the successes of the WTO. This is how she responded to that question.
The WTO is all about trade, and trade affects every single one of us. Even down in the rural areas, in the village, we produce things, we sell them to other people. Some of these things are sold on in bulk to people elsewhere, in other countries or even within the same country. So it's all about trade. And trade is one of the means by which we improve our living standards, our economics. So to the ordinary woman and man in the street, if you're talking about trading in goods that you produce or buying other goods, that's what the WTO rules underpin, and that's why it matters to the person on the street that this should work. And I just want to say that the WTO's rules also need to be upgraded to digital economy, the green economy, and it needs new rules to underpin micro, medium, and small enterprises and women in trade. That again is something that matters very much to the ordinary person, because in our countries in Africa, There's so many micro, medium, and small enterprises. Many of them are owned by women. And if we can get them to produce more, trade more, and be part of the regional and local supply chains, people's living standards will improve. That's why the WTO matters.
Yeah, and we also talked about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. She said this was an excellent opportunity for the continent. We also talked about African unity in that regard. And also, it's good to remember, Francis, that the WTO has a developmental agenda. So trade linked to the SDGs and the achievement of those 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. She also talked about that. But if people want to see more of the interview, they can watch African Perspective on the SABC News channel starting at 9 p.m. tonight.
Indeed, we'll play the full interview then. Sherwin, very interesting. You've been reporting that this decision needs to be made by consensus. So you need 164 member states to generally agree, which is interesting. What does that mean for each of these candidates in the coming weeks?
I like how you frame that. It certainly is interesting because consensus is, I often talk about how a consensus needs to be the 18th goal in terms of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, because it takes consensus to make various decisions, certainly within the multilateral context. So I asked her kind of like, what's her day-to-day like in terms of reaching this consensus and ensuring that the consensus falls at her feet, right? Because she is running against a South Korean candidate, the trade minister of South Korea, and she talked about she's met 130 ambassadors that are affiliated to the WTO. There's a lot of grueling work that goes into a campaign like this, because essentially you're leading a global body where you're trying to reach some sort of consensus with countries around the world, be they developing or developed, that have different interests as it relates to trade. So she's been working very hard. I also asked her if she was confident that she's got this in the bag. She talked a lot about her experience. She's a former managing director at the World Bank, number 2 essentially at the World Bank. She's a former finance minister, the longest-serving finance minister in Nigeria, also a foreign minister. She's currently also the chairperson of the board of the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, so very, very involved in the African Union's approach to getting an equitable vaccine distributed equitably around the world. She's the AU envoy in that regard, so a lot of experience that she's bringing to the table, but also a lot of hard work that goes into reaching consensus, and hopefully that will fall to her feet come the end of the month, Francis.
Yeah, I'm sure it's no exaggeration to say Africa is behind her. Sherwin, to shift gear a bit, let's look at Nigeria. We spoke to our correspondent in Abuja about the very worrying reports, even more violence reported today, he said, especially in Lagos, the epicenter of those demonstrations. So the UN, the Secretary-General, has condemned that violence. Just tell us a bit more about what he had to say.
Yeah, a hard-hitting statement released by the spokesperson's office here at the United Nations, Francis. The Secretary-General essentially condemning the actions by law enforcement. We are seeing reports now that up to at least 12 people have lost their lives given the police's response, or certainly law enforcement's response in Lagos State. This is what the spokesperson had to say reading that statement earlier today.
The Secretary-General said he is following closely the developments in Nigeria and calls for an end to reported police brutality and abuses. He condemns the violent escalation of the October 20th in Lagos, which resulted in multiple deaths and caused many injuries. The Secretary-General expresses his condolences to the bereaved families and wishes a speedy recovery to those injured. He calls on Nigerian authorities to investigate these incidents and hold the perpetrators accountable. The Secretary-General also urges the security forces to act at all times with maximum restraint while calling on protesters to demonstrate peacefully and to refrain from violence. The Secretary-General encourages the authorities to swiftly explore avenues to de-escalate the situation and reiterates the readiness of the United Nations to support national efforts towards finding a solution.
Yeah, so a hard-hitting statement certainly from the Secretary General. Stefan Dujarric also there confirming to us that the Secretary General Antonio Guterres did call President Muhammadu Buhari earlier this week to talk about these protests that essentially seek the removal of this police unit that certainly rights groups have labeled corrupt, including responsible for extortion, torture and murder. I asked Stefan what the Secretary General specifically said to the Nigerian president. He said the private discussions of the Secretary General match the public statement that they just released. So essentially what he said in that statement is what was conveyed privately by the Secretary General to Nigeria's head of state, Francis.
All right, thank you for that update, Sherwin. Also following the run-up to the US elections, we'll talk to you soon, our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease.